and that these people were people you could not talk to. You couldn't talk to them. They became non-persons. I could understand suddenly the Jacobin mentality of how to deal with opponents. You guillotine them. They didn't have the power to guillotine them. So what they did was essentially create them into non-humans. They exterminated them, at least visually. You had to walk by them, you couldn't address them. And I couldn't stand that, because I had been in the Young Communist League in the 1930s. And this is exactly the treatment that we were expected to bring to bear in dealing with Trotskyists and left-wing socialists. If your mother or your father or your uncle or your aunt or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or whatever you want, whatever language you want to use, or even your child happened to turn out to be a Trotskyist or even a left-wing socialist, they became non-persons. You had to break. You had to divorce or separate or move out or move them out. And I found that to be disgusting. I found that to be irrational, anti-human, totalitarian. I found it to be Stalinist. And I could not understand that policy, and I objected to that. I never became a situationist. And that was not the only reason. We also had differences. They believed in workers' councils. You see, they were greatly influenced by the council communists, a tendency that existed on the left around the time of the First World War and shortly after the Russian Revolution. In fact, Lenin wrote his notorious pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, to discredit these council communists who believed in workplace democracy and the formation of workshop councils. And they believed in that. And I thought, by that time I had gone through the labor movement. I don't know if any of them had ever seen the inside of a factory. But I had gone through the labor movement, and I found that that policy was ridiculous. And then there were other questions. They thought that ecology was ridiculous. They called it zoology, contemptuously. But they seemed to tolerate it because they did want to win me, frankly. And they wanted me to be, as much as possible, somewhat of a representative of situationism in the United States, an honor and distinction that I refused. But we left on cordial terms. There were also certain attributes, very self-serving. Claims were made that they had influences on movements that I knew they absolutely didn't have. They claimed to influence the Japanese student movement called the Zengakurin, which is a very, very militant student movement, incredibly, confrontational, even violent. They claimed to have an influence on the provost in Amsterdam. This is magnificent history that should never be forgotten, which I knew to be anarchist, because I went up to Amsterdam and I spoke to one of the people who helped form the provost, named after the proletariat, as they used to call themselves, and more precisely, provo in the sense of provoke. Not provoke violently, but engage in happenings which were extremely inventive and ingenious. One example is when they ran through the streets giving out a leaflet. When you picked up the leaflet, it said, "Write your own leaflet." That sort of stuff. A very artistic movement. And the leader, or I shouldn't say that they had any leaders, but the most influential person among them, Raoul van Dien, was long since departed from these principles, I guess. The last time I heard was that he was somehow or other connected with the Dutch government or a Dutch corporation. I can't tell you what their future is, really. Was a Bookchinist. His father had been a hardline Dutch anarchist, and anarchism has a very strong influence in Holland or in the Netherlands. It has a long tradition there, going back to the 19th century. And so I knew that I had no influence on them, on any of these groups, at least certainly those that I encountered. When I spoke to Van Dien, he amusingly said the Situationists came around, gave him an ultimatum. Be or not to be, so to speak. And this authoritarianism was shocking to me. And it was very clear to me that there were mainly two people, and principally one person, Mr. Guy Debord, who was the Situationist movement. And I left rather depressed after a while, initially very enamored and rather depressed by things that I had seen in the Stalinist movement and by archaisms that I had seen in the old workers' movement, like workers' councils, and by a wonderful body of ideas describing the spectacle, admitted so, but at the same time, and relating it to commodity production, and yet at the same time totally oblivious to ecological issues, to gender issues. I mean, for them, feminism didn't exist. Forget it. There was almost an element of misogyny in some of the views that I heard. And a disdain for anything that had to do with the new left and the counterculture, which had enormous potentialities at that time. They were really not part of the new left. And the myth is that they are, but they weren't. They were really an artistic movement, much more closely associated with architecture, city planning, and above all, enamored of the French tradition that culminated in surrealism, going back to Marquis de Sade, through L'Autrement, and Maldoror, Comte de L'Autrement, the mysterious Comte de L'Autrement, and going into surrealism, Dadaism, and particularly surrealism. And that they were really borrowing a lot of their ideas on everyday life from Henri Lefebvre, who at that time was still either close to the Communist Party of France or was drifting away. And that there was nothing original about their ideas of le quotidien, everyday life. And that many of their ideas on the spectacle were being nourished by their commitment and their interest in the surrealist movement, the attempt to change, give surreality to experience. So in these respects they were not original. But let's be very frank, they synthesized it in a very attractive way that would be particularly delightful to young people, young intellectuals. So I left with this feeling of disquiet that there were great fault lines in this phenomenon called situationism. Ecology, feminism, counterculture, an innovative form of anarchism. They were anti-anarchists. Many people think they're anarchists. They were furiously anti-anarchists. They regarded anarchism, borrowing from Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit, as absolute freedom, which leads to terrorism. And if ever I saw people who would have led into the Jacobin movement, it was these French situationists who created non-persons all over the place and expelled at the drop of a hat, and from a small clique in Paris. Well, when I came back, these differences began to become more marked. Venagem had come to the United States, had visited with me, and we got into a very serious dispute about an anarchistic group, which I personally found very irritating, because I thought it was rather aimless, but whose intentions, I felt, incidentally being a very artistic group, I don't know if I should use this word, but this is what they call themselves, up against the wall motherfuckers. And they were famous throughout the United States for their artistry, their cleverness, their improvisations. And despite the violence of their rhetoric, they were really not very violent. This was all just rhetoric, as so much of the 60s was rhetoric. And they began to become very guarded. Venagem became very guarded about associating with people like Up Against the Wall. They became very guarded about the ecological issue. They started to talk about, we have an expression in the United States which the Forest Service has created called Smokey the Bear. You see a bear with a ranger's hat, and Smokey always comes out with statements like, don't start forest fires, be kind to the grass, and so on and so forth. Clean your campground. They began to deal with ecology and ecological issues, of all things, these pronounced issues. They began nuclear power, everything like that. They began to deal with them as being absurd, irrelevant. The real thing was to form workers' councils. Well, who the hell needed situationism for that kind of argument? I could easily go back to Anton Pannekoek, the old council communists. Their literature was around. I could go back to others. That wasn't new.